But when her owners saw that their hope of gain was gone. Now, if I was going to underline any phrase, it would be that last one. Their hope of gain was gone. They seized Paul and Silas and dragged them into the marketplace before the rulers. And when they had brought them to the magistrates, they said, "These men are Jews, and they are disturbing our city." So let's think about what happened here. Looking at those verses we just read, what was the actual cause of the disturbance? Well, they were upset. They couldn't make money anymore because Paul cast out the moneymaker, the little demon that was inside the girl. He cast it out, that they were exploiting for profit, and she couldn't do it anymore. She couldn't do the fortune telling anymore. The men say, "Paul and Silas are here disturbing our city." But who disturbed the city? Who went and gathered up the crowd? Who went and walked around and said, "Hey, we got a problem here"? And they shook up the magistrates and brought everybody out into the street. Who did that? The upset men did. The slave owners did. So we need to recognize something. No matter what those men felt, Paul was right in the eyes of God. No matter what they said. Even if their governmental system allowed for this sinful practice to take place, or they just simply, like we see today, turned a blind eye to the obvious sin and trafficking happening before us, we can say it was objectively right what Paul did because God's laws always override man's laws. The men can complain all they want about their lost business, but that doesn't make Paul wrong. And Paul and Silas shouldn't feel 1 ounce of pity for the lost business they caused those men, because they shouldn't have had it in the beginning. This is a classic tactic employed in politics and the public square, especially in the media in recent years, I want to make you aware of. Often when a corruption or an evil is exposed and an outrage follows, we often see the one who exposed the evil come under more fire than the one who committed the evil. We see this all the time. I'll use a contemporary example that you might remember from a few years ago. There was an undercover investigation into Planned Parenthood, which sought to learn what they did with the remains of their abortions. It's always been a subject of discussion as exactly what they do with the discarded body parts and tissue, whether they sell them for profit, at what cost, and to who. Project Veritas ran an undercover camera operation to get the answers to find out. And a lawsuit was filed, not against Planned Parenthood, but against Project Veritas for trespassing and using undercover tactics. So in the end, a horrible evil was done, but the one who got in the most trouble was the one who tried to expose and end the evil. This happens all the time in our day. In this story, we see Paul and Silas were getting into more trouble for freeing the girl from bondage than the men who actually enslaved and exploited her. That's what we call a corrupt, unjust system. You know how you know when you live in a corrupt system? When righteous people are more likely to get in trouble for righteousness' sake than criminals are for committing crimes. If a criminal breaks into your home in the night and your first thought is, how do I defend my family without getting a lawsuit? You may live in a corrupt system. The claim was, they're disturbing our city. But how? How were they disturbing the city? What proof was offered? Well, they said they advocate strange customs. First of all, is that against the law? But anyway, that's really rich coming from guys trafficking a demon-possessed girl for profit. Suddenly they take the moral high ground. When you turn on the light and the cockroaches scatter, you don't blame the light for upsetting the cockroaches. Instead, you should be asking, why are there so many cockroaches around here? Essentially, the slave owners were upset. The gospel ruined their sinful lives, and they were upset at the godless chaos that ensued because they had been enjoying sin for personal gain. Sometimes, when the gospel goes into a new area, there will be a great celebration and people will bow their knee to Jesus. But sometimes, the demons will shriek and revolt and have the nerve to say that this revolt would never have happened if Christ would just stay inside the church walls from 10:30 to 11:30 a.m. on Sunday morning. Here's a thought for us Christians today. I want you to take this to heart. Everyone is good with Jesus until he starts flipping tables and saying, before Abraham was, I am. Everybody is good with the idea of wolves as long as they're in Yellowstone and not in my backyard. Everyone is good with Christians in theory until we start shaking up society and holding evil to account and acting like Christians in the world. So if you've been convinced, Christian, that we live in a pluralistic society and that we ought not impose our standards on other people because that's not what happens in a liberal democratic order, I want you to think about this little girl and ask, are you glad Paul imposed his Christian standards on those pagan slave owners? Are you glad for her sake? For justice and righteousness' sake? I'm glad they obeyed Christ, and I hope they would do it again. Aren't you glad that William Wilberforce imposed his Christianity on the British and ended the transatlantic slave trade? Aren't you? Aren't you glad William Carey and the Christian missionaries to India imposed their Christianity on them and stopped widows from having to jump on top of their husband's burning funeral fire? Aren't you glad that missionary Mary Slessor went to the tribal people of Nigeria and imposed her Christianity on them and stopped the practice of killing all twins and triplets that were born, thinking that they were demons? Christianity is about preaching the gospel. Yes, that's true. But it's also about establishing righteousness and justice on the earth because Christ is reigning as king. You don't have to call Drag Queen Story Hour a blessing of liberty in a pluralistic society. You can call it what it is: creepy groomer behavior and sinful before a holy God. Christ is Lord not only of the church, but of the public library and the public school system. And I know that's true because he's King of kings and he's Lord of lords. I've come to a conclusion in my life that Jesus is either Lord of all or he is not Lord at all. So don't buy the lie that we are supposed to live our lives and set our light under a bushel. Darkness would love for light to hide. Those slave owners and Satan would love it if Paul and Silas stayed back in Jerusalem and played church. But to quote the kids' song that you grew up with, hide it under a bushel? No, I'm going to let it shine. We just need to believe those lyrics. I would like to hope that in all the ruckus of the crowd, the little girl was grateful that Paul cast the demon out. I would like to hope that she was glad that someone risked disturbing the peace on her behalf. Jesus disturbed the peace for you, didn't he? He shook things up so you could be saved, didn't he? Guess what? Jesus was pretty comfortable in heaven, surrounded by the heavenly host singing, "Holy, holy, holy." But for you, he took on flesh and entered a manger stall and lived as a man in first century Nazareth and was hated by people and was called a criminal and was nailed to a cross. He disturbed the status quo when you were in bondage. Aren't you thankful that he did? You see, it's always easy to do absolutely nothing. I would say that's the easiest thing to do in the world is nothing. But you, Christian, are not called to nothing. You are called to that which Christ and the apostles did, and sometimes you will have to disturb the status quo, be a disruption to the sinful systems of this world. And I know that I'm glad that Christ did that for me. You might have to do it for somebody else.